Hi again then guys, and welcome to the 62nd episode of Days Gone By, the review series for Gran Turismo's classic car lineup. And this episode was incidentally supposed to be on Wednesday, but I totally forgot what day it was and did the Gran Turismo 4 episode featuring the SO Supra instead. So we've had a bit of a change up this week, but returning to form now with this episode, we're discussing a car which is one of the most outstanding examples of a classic British sports car. The Lotus Elan, one of the best known Lotus models, one of the cars which started to really put them on the map, to get them noticed, to make them a known entity, if you will, a known name to be respected in the performance car world. Now, the Elan isn't a car that's based around the concept of a big engine or big power or even necessarily big straight line performance, and that is actually one of the things which has pretty much always been there with the Lotus lineup, Lotus's lineage, be it road cars or race cars, and that is that they have always focused more on lightweight cornering, manoeuvrability and handling rather than sheer straight line power, be it the Grand Prix, be it a road going sports car, even vehicles like the Esprit, which is a totally upmarket version of what you'd consider a Lotus to be, still focuses a lot more on handling than a car of its type typically would. The Esprit is more of a straight line machine than many other Lotus models, but even so, it doesn't go as much towards sheer power as some of its rivals, such as Ferraris, Lambos, Maseratis, Porsches, that kind of thing. But at the same time, although it doesn't have as much power, it's just as good as many of them. So is that the case for a vehicle like this? Because in the classic car category, discussing, say, 60s cars for instance, the specs and the performance of a vehicle from that era can vary wildly, especially when you're talking pure sports cars, which of course is what this is. Now, the price tag on the Elan is 58,000 credits, or a fraction under. That's not a bad price. It is, after all, not a premium car, and it doesn't have huge numbers to work with, so you wouldn't want it to be ridiculously expensive, but at the same time 58 grand is a decent enough price for a classic to make it a good collector's piece. It's not a stupid price, but it's not necessarily as affordable for what it is as you might expect it to be. So what do you get for that price? Well, the engine is relatively small. It's a 1.6 litre, it's rear-wheel drive, front engine, and you can turbocharge the vehicle up to 241 horsepower. That's not insane, as we said. They don't go for that kind of power, but still, for a car of its size, and especially for a car of its weight, that's a pretty decent amount of power to be working with. Now, speaking of that weight, Lotus models are known, of course, for being lightweight. People think of the Lotus Elise. It's a very lightweight vehicle. Obviously the Lotus 7, which ultimately became the Caterham, known for being lightweight. In fact, the Caterham is one of the lightest cars on Gran Turismo. This car really does make a lot of the other classics look heavy in comparison. It weighs half as much as many other classic sports cars, and it puts modern sports cars to shame in terms of the weight that it's running, even small ones like the Mazda Miata. Because this car only weighs 566 kilos. That's the kind of weight that you'd expect from something like a tiny Japanese front-wheel drive K car with ridiculously small proportions and a cheap price, not from a sports car. And because that weight is so low on this vehicle, it means that although the power isn't overly high, and neither is the torque, it doesn't even have 200 foot-pounds, but the fact that that weight is so low means that horsepower per tonne is beyond 400. 426 is an excellent amount of horsepower per tonne for a car like this to have, for a vehicle that's so small and relatively underpowered compared to many other cars in this series, many of which have nearly double the power, if not more than double the power, sometimes bordering on 3 times the power of this car. that is a huge advantage for this car to have in its corner, because in a straight line it's never going to be able to keep up with something like a classic American car like a Corvette Stingray, or even other classic European cars like a Jag E-Type, or a classic Japanese car like the Toyota 2000 GT. It just doesn't have that kind of straight line performance. But what it does have is an ultra compact layout, ultra low weight, and fantastic cornering speed potential. And that goes beyond just having good handling. As I've mentioned before on the channel, you could have a good handling car that isn't necessarily that competitive. After all a car really needs to do to have good handling is to drive slowly. So having good handling isn't necessarily an inclination that a car will win races. For a car really to have good handling, it needs to have good handling while driving quickly, or while dealing with a large amount of power. And although this car doesn't have the latter, it can certainly do the former. This car can take corners at very high speeds easily, challenging vehicles with 2 or 3 times the amount of power. And although personally, I must admit, I'm not a huge fan of the Lotus Elan, I'm not a huge fan of Lotus in general. I like many of their models, but I don't love them. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge that this is an excellent performance car for the numbers that it's given to work with. The only slight downside that I would say the Elan has, and this is unfortunately one which isn't going to surprise anyone really, is that the PP level is too high. Not because it's too good for the car, but because the PP system in general on Gran Turismo just doesn't work that well. They factor in things which just don't work that way. It's what I call the classic Red Bull Junior syndrome, that a car has a PP level based more on its low weight and high horsepower per tonne ratio rather than its actual performance, which results in a vehicle being far too high for its own good. I.e., the Red Bull Junior. There is no way that that car can take on any other vehicle with a similar PP level. It loses to literally all of them around the track. This one isn't that ridiculous. It's a 530 pp vehicle, which isn't stupidly high, but it's just a little bit too high given its actual straight line performance. And although straight line performance isn't everything, it does factor in a lot on many tracks. So overall, it's a car which isn't going to dominate, but it's worth a look, especially for classic fans. But that's it overall for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.